Hello everyone and welcome to our intro to deck building for Star Wars Destiny. We're going to be going over some basic tips to building your first couple of decks for Star Wars Destiny. If you started with the starters, which we did in our first couple of videos in Learning Destiny, which this is a part of, this will be kind of the next step for you. We're going to be using these exact tips and guides to build our next decks for the next video in this series.
It's going to happen. Now, Zach, I must say, before we get started, there's a video lingering around out there, an early Destiny video that you did that was a very similar kind of thing, right? A basic deck building thing.
We did a basic deck building guide, and a lot of that advice
What's changed?
Still holds, but obviously at the time we recorded that, it was before the game even came out. We were playing with just like some starters and a couple cards. And I even said it in that video, but that video was, if I could go back and tell myself things I wish I had known when I first started building decks, the first couple of times, this is what I would say.
Oh, nice.
And a lot of those principles still hold. This is kind of a similar structure, but with some updated knowledge and experience, given that we're a little over a year into the game now.
Well, the first question, I guess, is what is deck building and why am I doing it?
That's a good question. So part of what makes a collectible game or any customizable game worth its salt is that you get to customize the deck that you bring to the table, and that every opponent you play has their own take on cards. Even with the same characters in play, you might have completely different ideas going on.
So you get to kind of build a machine, as it were. So I have the starter decks, and I'm playing that back and forth, and it's like, well, that could kind of get stale after a while.
Sure.
But
so you
what
can
if
customize it.
I start pulling other cards and putting them now? I'm surprising my opponent and these kinds of things.
Sure.
So it continuously evolves.
So the first step in this, to me, and this is one of my favorite parts of Destiny, is the fact that you get to choose the characters you start the game with, and this is referred to as your team. So you get to build your team, and we'll pull Poe and Rey up so you can see them. And on the bottom left of those characters are the point cost. So this tells you the first point cost is how many points that character costs to bring one die. The second number is to bring two of that die to the game.
Can you bring three?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Potentially on a character you might be able to in the future, I guess. But if there was a third number, you would be able to bring three, I guess.
And that's a common question, and this is called elite, making a character elite. So you have two modes. If you have one character, if you're using their first point cost, one die, basic, normal character, you can do that. Then the second die makes that character elite, and it gives them the second point cost instead.
And a one die character is referred to a lot of times as a regular character. So I'll say regular Rey or elite Rey, kind of a thing. But you get 30 points to work with, and you can build that however you want, right? So you get to choose your characters. And as you'll see, the Rey and Poe from the two-player starter that came out in 2017, if you ran both of those at elite, you would have 30 points, and they're structured like that probably intentionally.
And it's really good.
It is really good,
it's
actually,
crazy good. And at least for me, like I'm always leaning towards elite characters, because you got to think, let's say you paid 12 to get one die on the table.
Yep.
Would you pay 3 more to get another of that same die? So you have already invested a lot of cost in these characters. Making them elite is a lot of times a very good value.
Yep, and a couple other tips just when you're picking your initial team. I like to have at least 2 colors when I'm starting, so you'll notice that Rey and Poe are red and blue, and that means that you can include red and blue and then neutral, of course, gray kit cards in your deck when you're building your deck, which we'll get to in a minute. But having 2 different colors means that a lot of times you'll have a lot more options when it comes to the cards you can choose to put into your deck. Another recommendation is getting, like you were saying, elite characters, so 4 dice if possible. When your starting team having 4. Sometimes, like the original first Vader that ever came out was 16 points for 1 die, and so you could run one of his, and then if you ran a 14-point regular character, you could literally start with 2 dice.
Yeah.
Not recommended. And then
now 3 you can get by with sometimes, depending on the characters.
Depending on the characters.
At the start, just stick with 4 or even more dice, which is possible.
If you can get more, yeah. But at least 4, if possible, on your starting team is just kind of a rule of thumb, good place to start. And finally, when it comes to your starting characters, looking at the damage and the icons on the characters. So Poe and Rey, they happen to work because one has melee damage, one has range damage, which you might imagine as those characters do. But neither of them have modifier sides. So that's a plus symbol and a blue on those types of damage. And if they did, that's when it kind of gets sticky. Yeah. Because if a character has a lot of modified sides, you need the regular black side to be able to resolve it. But if possible, look at bringing characters that have similar icons, because that's really going to help you just be more efficient with your deck.
You're really looking at damage sides too. I mean, I think it's fine to have like this character has disrupt, this character has discard, this character has a resource. But when you're thinking about damage, which is the basic unit of the game, I mean, this is the bread and butter of the game. When you have one of your characters as melee and one of your characters as ranged, a lot of times you're just going to be hard pressed to find, first of all, cards that work with both. So you might have very powerful ranged upgrades that have plus sides for range damage, and then you might have very powerful melee cards. What happens if your melee hero dies, and then you draw all your melee cards, and you're sitting over here with a ranged hero with a blaster? So, you just find yourself in those situations where the inconsistency of having 2 damage types is not worth it. Now, of course, it's not a hard and fast rule. There are successful decks that can do both.
Totally, and I think that's this whole, all the advice here is very much when you're building your first couple of decks, these are just rules of thumbs to stick by to get into the game. And once you start learning, once you understand the rules, you can know when to break them.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, I think the next most important thing to talk about is cards that bring dice to the table. So this is upgrades, this is supports. Once you've built your team, the next place I'm looking naturally is the cards that are going to add dice to my deck. And just as a rule of thumb, I think 10 to 12 is the right number.
This has gotten lower. Ultimately, I think it used to be as high as 16.
Well, and even I wrote an article a while back about going way lower, and just the value of it, and that's more advanced. We'll talk about that in the advanced deck building guide. But here, I think just starting, look for 10 to 12 cards that are ringing dice, and you naturally want these icons, again, to line up with your character icons. So,
do supports count for this, or is this just
supports
upgrades?
do count. So any kind of dice being added, because naturally you gain resources throughout the game, and you're wanting to add more dice to your options, and so that comes in the form of both upgrades and also supports. So upgrades that go on the characters, and supports that just go into play. If they have plus sides, just be sure that your characters have those icons on them. You're really also looking for as many of these to be 2 cost or less as possible. You only get 2 resources around. And so the 3 cost upgrades aren't going to be playable on the first turn. And if you spend your money each round, they're not going to be playable on subsequent turns. They're just harder to get into play.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I'll pull the heirloom lightsaber up. Redeploy is an amazing keyword. So it is a 3 cost upgrade. If you're going to go 3 cost, this is a keyword initially up front that I'm looking for. When one of your characters dies with a redeploy upgrade, it's going to move over to the other character, and it's not going to be resources that are wasted.
It's really important. So think about the difference here. So let's say I invest 3 resources in an upgrade onto a character. I get to use it for 2 turns, then that character dies and all of it goes away. How different is that from investing 3 in a character, I use it for 2 turns, then it goes over here and I use it for 3 more turns. So if you think about investing versus the amount of use that you're getting out of something, the investment in a redeploy asset, especially early in the game, is absolutely critical. It allows that thing to do work for the rest of the game, which is incredibly powerful. So keep that in mind. It's also worth noting that there are a number of different upgrades. Like there's weapons, there's things that add sides, there are techie type things, there are upgrades that change sides to different things. So not all dice are necessarily created equal, because I could put together 10 or 12 dice that really aren't ever going to do a whole lot for me. So how do I determine what kind of dice I'm looking for?
Early on for me, the dice I'm looking for most are usually ones that do damage.
Yeah, just straight up, like, let's play the game.
Yeah, I mean, 1 or 2 cost upgrades that you can add to your deck that when you play them, they're going to help you start doing more damage throughout the game. And again, you can get fancier as things go on.
Absolutely.
And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next thing I want to mention, which is dice control. And so this is, a lot of upgrades will have that ability, which is they can, and a really good example is Force Stasis, that can add damage or control dice, right? So when
Classic force stuff here.
That's right. So when I say control dice, I don't just mean your opponent's dice. It's yours and your opponent's. So this is the ability to manipulate. It's a dice game. You can roll things you don't want, but having cards that either allow you to change the result of your opponent's die or change the result of your own dice is really important. And so just as a rule of thumb, I like to have 8 to 12 cards in my deck that do this.
Right.
So it can be upgrades. It can also just not be upgrades. In the 2-player starter, a really good example of this is Clash. This is a card that both changes an opponent's die and your own. And so it's obviously a very high value card. But when I'm just sitting down to build a deck, up front, 8 to 12 cards that are going to allow you to manipulate the dice.
And let's just imagine why is this so important, right? So let's say my opponent has 8 damage showing, 1, 2 black melee, and then 3 + 2 melee dice. If for 0, 1 resource, I can take that black melee die away, I just went from taking 8 damage to taking 0 damage. And that is the difference in the game. I mean, that's winning or losing the game.
Even if not as extreme, if they had a 2 damage and a +2, taking the 2 away, saving 4 damage.
It's 4 versus 0.
Yeah, and you could spend that same money potentially on like an upgrade as an example, and is that upgrade, just for mathematical purposes, going to ever add 4 damage? Like
Right.
the
That's
swing
the
there is
question.
really big.
Let's actually, I want to break into that just a little bit because it does matter in deck building, really understanding these concepts. Destiny is ultimately going to be about choosing to invest in your characters now so that they can do more later, or taking away damage from your opponent at this very moment. And you're having to figure out that swing. So a control card that's preventing 2 or 3 damage, what is that worth versus the same cost that you could put on an upgrade that might do 2 or 3 damage over the next 2 to 3 turns? Those are the decisions you have to make. So having a good balance of building your own characters up, but also limiting the options of your opponent's characters is what we're talking about here when we say dice cards versus control cards. So that's a really important concept, and you kind of want a nice balance of each.
Yeah, and that's ultimately why, like, if you back out a little bit, recommending here as a rule of thumb, 10 to 12 dice cards, 8 to 12 control cards. That's most of your 30-card deck, and it's either adding dice or manipulating dice, because this is a dice game.
Right.
So you shouldn't be surprised. And then to kind of move on to another leg before you finish building out your deck, right? So even if you include 12 dice cards, 12 control cards, we still have 6 spots open.
Okay, that's 24.
But before making that choice, I like to talk about the battlefield. So you build your team, you're looking at building your deck, and then every team gets to bring a battlefield, and the battlefield is a unique ability.
It's where they like to party.
This is where the fight's actually happening. And so when I'm looking at a battlefield, obviously the first thing you're going to naturally want to do is look at battlefields that help you. So if your deck like the Rey from the 2-player starter, if she has a shield, she gets to do an extra damage. So the Obi-Wan's Hut from the 2-player starter gives a blue character a shield.
What could go wrong?
Makes sense. Now, the other thing to consider with the battlefield is, how is this going to benefit my opponent?
Oh, no.
Yes, so if it is going to benefit your opponent, you just have to realize that if they move faster in a turn than you, they might get this benefit. And so if it is disproportionately good for your opponent than you, that's obviously a bad choice. But the other thing to really think about is, whoever goes second gets the 2 free shields at the start of the turn.
Yeah.
So if you have a battlefield that is never going to be bad for you, your opponent's going to not probably want to pick that. And so in that case, anytime I can choose a battlefield that my opponent doesn't want to pick, I feel like I'm making a pretty good choice. A classic example of this is...
It's hard to find those, but they do exist.
But even Obi-Wan's Hut, if my opponent doesn't have blue characters, it's not a great battlefield for them.
Right.
And so if I get to be on that battlefield, it's probably only going to benefit me. And so you're really just looking for synergy here with the characters and the cards that you're already playing, which is why I like looking at it after I've kind of already built my deck.
Yeah.
But that said, this kind of points, I mentioned the word synergy, and I think this is important, which is...
Synergy.
It's like a motivational speech. But when you
it's
look...
a YouTube video.
Yeah, when you look at your characters and your upgrades and your control cards and your battlefield, there should be a natural synergy that starts to happen. So I like looking at the Kylo from the 2-player starter and the card As I Have Foreseen. And so As I Have Foreseen, 0-cost ambush, lets you look at your opponent's hand and then take another action. In general, this is a card that I almost never include in a deck. It is just getting to randomly see my opponent's hand doesn't have enough value to take up a card. But when it's in a deck with Kylo, whose ability is naturally better when you know what's in your opponent's hand, it's suddenly a very playable card. And so that is a fundamental kind of example of synergy, making a card better. And so when it comes to the last 6 cards of your deck and your battlefield choice, synergy is really important to consider. So as an example, bringing the Rey from the 2-player starter back, Obi-Wan's Hut is very synergistic with her because you really want that shield on her for that
blue
free
character
damage.
wants a shield. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a perfect match.
It works really well. So when it comes to the last 6 cards, I'm looking for synergy. When it comes to the battlefield, same thing. And
just filling in the gaps.
Really filling in the gaps.
Now what else you could do, sorry to interrupt, you're really on a nice train of thought there. You could also just do 6 more control cards.
Or 6 more.
Or 6 more dice cards,
You
right?
can't go wrong. So that's kind of my kind of concluding point, which is, for your first deck, once you built your team, if a card is not adding dice, if a card is not manipulating dice, or if a card is not directly providing synergy with your characters and your upgrades in your battlefield,
rip it up.
You really don't need it. And I will say, just for fun, just for enjoyment, if you have a card that you particularly like, you think this should be cool to play, highly recommend it. Use those 6 slots for that.
It's close quarters assault
for me. Have fun. That's the one-ofs, just the random, whatever you're gonna have fun with. But for your first couple decks, again, control, dice control, dice addition, synergy with your characters, And then at that point, it's just either fun or it's working.
Yeah,
with you.
have fun with stuff. Like Star Wars to me is so much about the theme and the idea of being in the universe with the characters and kind of situations that I enjoy. So I can build a pretty competitive deck and still make some wonky choices with those last 4, 5, 6 cards. That might not be optimal, but the cool thing about optimal in a customizable game is that so much of optimal doesn't really come down to the numbers alone. It's about what your opponent's prepared for and what they're expecting. So at like really high level play, your opponent is trying to anticipate the cards that you have in your deck. And if you're making only the most optimal by the numbers choices, then they know exactly what you have. So you can conclude some kind of like second tier cards that nobody's expecting, and they build this entire turn thinking there's no way this person has this card.
Sure, like Anticipate.
And then you blow it, yeah, Anticipate or Mind Trick, and it just ruins them. Which is really exciting. And so I like to include cards that I find really fun for the last 4 to 6 slots. And the rest I can be very hardcore, like, these have got to be great cards.
And these are just fundamentals to make sure that you aren't just, that you can build in the game and actually participate
play.
and not feel like you're just getting smashed.
Just getting
But
trounced.
Those are the basic tips. We'll be using these tips in our next video. We're going to be playing a game with the 2-player and the character starters, so you can tune in for that. And until next time, keep playing and have fun.
Thank you so much for watching this video. We have more videos in the Learning Destiny series conveniently wrapped in a YouTube playlist, so you can find them over there.
Or if you want an even better experience, head to our website for the Learning Destiny series, where we have blogs and deck lists and really just a format that makes it super easy to learn how to play Destiny.
It is better.
Thanks again for watching, and until next time, keep playing.